More churches in America every year are closing than are opening.
Today, we're talking to the pastor of a church that made the decision to close their church earlier this year.
This is a church that opened its doors for the first time more than 150 years ago.
We wanted to hear the story firsthand, but also talk about the broader implications that this rising trend could have on the future of the Christian faith in America.
Let's dive in. Well, hey there, and welcome to the Pro Church Tools Show. We're here to help you and your church navigate the biggest communication shift in 500 years. I'm Brady Shearer, your host. I'm joined as always by my co-host, it's Alexander Mills.
Hello, hello.
And back again, we are joined by Ryan Burge. Ryan, great to see you.
Great to see you guys.
Ryan, thanks for joining us again. And as the title of this show says, we don't want to shy away from it. Frankly, you're still in the recent wake of recently closing a church that you pastored for nearly 2 decades. And so today we want to talk about it, but we don't want to talk about it in a way that's a post-mortem exactly, because we followed your work for years and really appreciated you and the insight you bring to this space. And then more recently, we've had the opportunity to bring you on the show and become friends. So, today we want to talk to you as a person, as a pastor, and also as a church demographic researcher, because in the context of this conversation, all of those things kind of intersect in a really, really fascinating way. And just said plainly, you recently closed the doors of your church. And so we do want to talk about that. But I want to start where you started. So tell me a little bit about the church and the congregation that you inherited when you began pastoring at First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon in 2006.
Yeah, so I'd been a youth pastor for a couple of years, a little church in Centralia, Illinois, kind of fell into ministry, to be honest with you. I never had that Isaiah 6 moment, where it's like, here I am, Lord, send me. And I had this kind of epiphany that I was supposed to be a minister. But I did that it was supposed to be a 3-month internship, turned into a 3-year gig. And then I pastored a little church in Marion, Illinois for a year. And I actually was trying to leave the ministry, to be honest with you. I got an assistantship in grad school, which paid me to work for them and get free tuition and all that good stuff. And I thought, well, that'll be fine. And then maybe I can preach on the weekends every once in a while. And they called me, First Baptist in Mount Vernon called me, and I preached one Sunday. They called, will you preach next Sunday? I said, sure. And then they called up and said, would you like to be our pastor? And this was the interim pastor at that point. And I said, I guess. If that's what you want me to do. And it turned into a 17-and-a-half-year position. Went from 20, my mid-20s to my early 40s as the pastor of First Baptist Church. When I got there in 2006, there were about 50 people on an average Sunday, and I was in my mid-20s, and the youngest person beside me was in their mid-50s. So it was already an older congregation even in those days, and it was a female-leaning congregation, a congregation that had been in decline for a long, long time. It was 350 people in the 1960s. It was 100 people in the mid-1990s. And like I said, when I took over, it was in the 50s. And I think in the beginning, they thought that I was going to be the spark that was necessary to grow the church back to what it was before. And, I think we all had that mentality for the first couple of years. And, as you guys know, that did not happen. The church actually never grew year to year. We declined slowly some years, but we never had a year where we actually added more people than we lost.
Did you feel that sentiment too when you joined? You mentioned you kind of did it reluctantly, or as my dad would say in his pastoral journey, kicking and screaming. But there's an elderly woman in our congregation who famously says, "Hey, when you do a job once and you do it right, it's going to be your job forever." And so it seems like that may have been your experience, when at your church. But was that your sense too when you decided, okay, I'm going to accept this call, I'm going to be the pastor? Did you feel like, hey, we can do this, we can turn the ship around?
Yeah. I was a big believer in. There's an old saying from John Wesley that if you set yourself on fire, people will come to watch you burn. And I thought if I preached well enough and I, ministered well enough and I led well enough and I did all these things well enough that any congregation is salvageable, right? We could turn this thing around. And I guess that's like youth naivete too, right? The savior complex that a lot of, to be frank, white guys have about these kind of things. Like, get me in there and I can right this ship. And I think, I don't know how it happened, but it happened very slowly. I think the congregation and myself both came to the realization probably 3 or 4 years in that, man, we were probably too far gone. And once you get below a certain point, it's not impossible to turn a church around. Don't mishear me there. It's just a whole lot harder once you get below about 50 people and the average age drifts up into the 60s. Like, I had every once in a while, we'd have a young couple come in, they'd look around, and they'd go, wow, this is, I'd like to hear you preach, but I don't want to be around 65, 75-year-old people in church. And so they would go to the other church down the street that has a much younger demographic. So it's really, really hard to recover. And, I was kind of in a situation where the church was already going to die before I took over. And unfortunately, I was just incapable, or, it didn't happen. Where, the church just went on the same trajectory it always was on, which was toward our closure.
So you said something interesting there. 3 to 4 years in to you being the pastor, you and the elder board, like the congregation is kind of getting a feel of like where this is heading. If you start in 2006, that means like that's 2010. Yeah. So 15 years elapsed before the official final Sunday service. What took so long, or what's happening within those 15 years if you already felt like, hey, we know where this is headed?
Yeah, I think it's, Ernest Hemingway was asked how he went bankrupt, and he said really slowly, then all at once. And that's kind of how it felt with our church. Is we all knew where we were headed, but no one wanted to talk about it. I think that's the issue, is because it's like you can talk about it all you want, but it's not going to change the reality of where we're headed. So it was it was all like side conversations of like, well, we need to, loan some money from our wills and bequests fund to our general fund to stay open this year. And wow, we seem to be doing that more and more every year now. And man, this building is becoming a real albatross, a financial albatross on our necks. We need to figure out a way to get rid of that. So it was a true Midwestern style, by the way. You don't talk about the big thing. You talk about the other parts of the big thing. And it's not the church closing. It's, well, how do we make it one more year? And how do we make it 2 more years? And how do we get rid of this problem? And how do we overcome this thing? So it was only like the focus was always on what's the thing in front of us immediately, not the big question that's looming at the end of the tracks. And then we got to a point where all those obstacles that were before the big decision at the end had been removed, and we were only left with the big scary thing at the end. And it's funny because in our when we first started talking about this seriously was probably the start of the year, and we had a business meeting, and I thought about that business meeting in my head for years. How was it going to go when someone actually made the motion to close the church? Would there be fighting? Would there be discussion? Would there be yelling? Would there be dissension? And there was none of that. I think that whole meeting lasted 20 minutes from start to finish. I mean, there was no one who stood up and said, no, we should keep this thing going. Everyone just sort of was resigned to their fate. So I think that 10 or 15 years was a process of all of us coming to the realization that it was time to pull the plug. And I think we were all, we were all happy about it, but I think we were all resigned to where we were, and there was just no reason to fight because we knew there was nothing to fight for at that point, really.
I think you touched on this a bit in an article you wrote in 2021, an article I found a lot of value in. It was an opinion piece for RNS called, As a Pastor, I Pray My Flock Comes Back, but as a religion demographer, I'm much more realistic. And in that article, you talk about, the waning congregation that you were serving, and you were saying like, hey, I'm not alone. We're not alone in what we're seeing, because we know that pastors and congregations all over the country are seeing the same thing. And it's the number of folks who are not identifying with any religious tradition, or we call them the nuns, is rising as congregation sizes are shrinking. And you've published a book on this topic. We've talked about this, the nuns, where they come from, who they are, and where they're going. But here we are in 2024, so 3 years after that article, and your church has celebrated their last Sunday service. But the rise of nuns, as you've recently published, seems to have plateaued. You wrote recently about this on your Substack. So can you talk to us now about like what you're seeing today in 2024 as it contrasts to what we were seeing in 21, 22, even 23? And are the rise of nuns, has it plateaued? Have we kind of reached the boiling point here?
So I think we're in actually a really interesting point in the trend line of non-religious people. So the way I think about it is between like 1991 and 2020 was an era. And we're going to look back on this in 50 years. I won't, because I'll be dead, but other people will look back on this in 50 years. And we'll say like that was an era of rapid secularization in America, where we went from 5% non-religion to 30% non-religion in a span of 3 decades, which is incredibly quick. In terms of religious demography, doesn't work that way. It's incredibly glacial most times. Like, you might move 2 points in 5 years, but the nuns rose 25 points in 30 years, which is just unbelievable. And then I think what we're seeing now going forward is the nuns have slowed down. They're still rising, but rising at a much slower rate than they were during that 30-year window. So, instead of the nuns rising 25 points in the next 30 years, they might rise 8 points in the next 30 years, or 10 points in the next 30 years. So the rise is going to continue, but think of like a startup after they've been around for 10 years. And that first, 8 years, they're growing exponentially, 60%, 80%, 100% a year. And then you grow 7% a year and everyone's happy about it. Like, I think that's where the nuns are right now, is that we went through a period where a lot of people who were marginally attached to religion sort of fell away from religion and were more likely to identify as non-religious in the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. And now whatever's left over, the people who are still religious are actually much more attached to religion. So it's going to be harder for them to become nuns. So that's a huge change, because it's not, millions and millions of people leaving church now. It's just generational replacement is what's taking us down, which is a much slower, more methodical process.
Well, and you just said it, right? Like you ascribe the rise of nuns simply to secularization, which is something that as pastors and preachers and just folks who work in church, and not even just in church, but who live in Western culture, are experiencing in all sorts of different ways. And secularization simply is just the theory that as nations become more educationally advanced and economically prosperous, they will in turn become less religious. So, governments, they try and fight against globalization by raising tariffs and stuff. But churches are trying to combat secularization by, installing an LED wall or injecting a little more haze onto the stage or something. But it just doesn't seem that like the things we're investing in to stave off secularization in the church are proving to be worth our money, our time, our investment. So if these things aren't working, what do you think that churches can do amidst an increasingly secularized culture to not just survive, but thrive?
I think the one thing they need to orient themselves around is the concept of success doesn't mean growth. That's one thing I had to reorient the way I thought about things, because I'm a numbers guy, right? So I want to see trend lines in my own life going up, whether it be Substack subscriber counts or publications or whatever it is. I want to see those numbers go up. And I think in the religious sphere, what you've got to understand is that there's a lot more headwinds in religion than there are tailwinds right now. I think it was almost easy to grow a church in the 1950s. I mean, most parts of America were growing rapidly. Education was increasing rapidly. Economic prosperity was increasing rapidly. And the people seemed to be hungry for religion in the post-war period. We're not in that period anymore. I've said this, and I'll say this many times. If Billy Graham was born 40 years later, he would have not been Billy Graham, because he walked into the largest, potential flock, possible in the 1950s. If he was born in 1950, he'd be trying to do that in the 1980s, which would not have been nearly as easy. So I think what pastors need to realize is you are operating inside this macro level forces, right, that are changing American society every day. And to use the tactics that were used 30 years ago is just completely illogical based on what's happening to us around us right now. I think our job, and this is what I keep telling people, what I realized in my last couple of years, and listen, to be completely frank with you, I beat myself up for maybe 10 years as pastor of First Baptist Church because I was not doing my job in terms of growing the church, turning the church around, revival, and any of those things. I got to the point where I realized that what God called me to was to be a hospice pastor. That every pastor's calling is not to, start a church that grows to 5,000 people. That's not success. God calls me to be faithful, and that's it. And faithful in the situation that I was in for as long as I was called to be in that situation, which I believed was to the end of that church. So I want to say to those kind of pastors who are listening to this, possibly who are in a congregation that's, was 150 10 years ago, now it's 110. I see you. God sees you, and God honors the ministry that you're involved with. Your job is to preach the gospel as best you can, love the community as best you can, serve folks, build the kingdom as best you can. And if your church doubles in size, that's great. And if it's half the size in 10 years, that's fine too. Because your job is not to grow a church. Your job is to do your best in the situation that you're in. It's hard to grow a church in, let's say, rural Pennsylvania. It's hard to grow a church in rural Illinois. It's a lot easier to grow a church in places like Arizona or Charlotte, North Carolina, or Southern California. People are moving in left and right. So let's just be honest with ourselves about not everything is our fault. Not saying we don't have control over what's happening, but not everything is our fault. When you start thinking that way, you start realizing what can I change and what can't I change, and start working on the things that you can.
I wanted to ask a question that I've been wrestling with myself a bit, Ryan. You talked about there was that 10-year period where you're kind of beating yourself up, being like, hey, this needs to be going in one way and it's not. This must be an indictment upon my own efforts or capability. You're saying, hey, you got to look at the bigger trends. And look, sometimes there are these waves heading in one direction. You can stand and fight the waves as much as you want, but what's going to happen is eventually a big wave is going to knock you down. It's always best to just go with the waves because you cannot control the waves. My tension always there is, and this is the questions that I ask myself as I run my own organization, is like, at what point am I acknowledging the greater trends? And at what point am I saying, like, I'm just like writing a narrative that removes some of my own culpability and makes me feel a bit better? I know neither are fully true. How did you kind of navigate that very difficult thing? How do you discern that?
Yeah, that's the tough part, right? Is to hold those two ideas in tension at one time. And I was talking to someone yesterday about how I think about myself. And I think two things. One is that 16-year-old me would think that 42-year-old me is killing it in terms of career and success and books and audience and all that stuff. But the other part of me is, but you're not doing enough.
Yeah.
Okay. You have to live in the tension of you are doing what you're supposed to do. You are called by God. You can't beat yourself up too much and you can't pat yourself on the head too much. You've got to kind of do those things in equal measure. And I think in my own personal, mental, and spiritual journey, where I'm the worst off is when I do too much of one and not enough of the other. I've got to keep those two ideas in balance in my head, that I'm doing great, but I could be doing more. That is the tension that has to exist in us, not just as pastors, by the way, but as human beings to move forward. And I believe that God gave me gifts and talents. And then if I don't use those gifts and talents, then I'm betraying the gift that God gave me. And I think that to me is the worst sin I could commit in my life. I think most other people, I don't know if they feel that way. I honestly don't know. But for me, it's how do I live out that calling that I have? And I think as long as you're moving closer to that, that's success. Now, is every day a huge success in moving closer to using the gifts that God gave you? No, we all know that. But over a 30-day period, 60-day period, 90-day period, are you closer today than you were 90 days ago? And if the answer is no, then what are you doing? Maybe you're sitting on your laurels too much. Maybe you're patting yourself on the head too much. And the other thing is, if you beat yourself up too much, it almost becomes this downward spiral, right? Of like, I'm not good enough, like I'm not capable of this, I'm not equipped for this. So I think how you balance that really is the key of your life. The thing I always try to be is really thoughtful and mindful about where I'm at mentally. Right? Like, where am I right now? How am I feeling? Why am I feeling that way? Can I intentionally try to change my intention today to point myself in a better direction? I think that is the thing that I probably do better than I think lots of people do, is think about how I think. It's called metacognition. It's something I learned in undergrad. And I think we all would be better off. Where am I in relationship to God? Where am I in relationship to my wife and my children and my work? Asking yourself those questions on a regular basis will help you. If you get off course, it's easier to get back on course if you do it quickly, as opposed to waiting a week or 2 weeks or 5 weeks or 10 weeks.
Yeah, I talk about that in terms of a phrase I call the rebound delay. Like how long are you taking between like the bad day that you had and then getting back into the right rhythms, or the bad thinking that you let yourself get spiraled down into? How quick do you pull yourself out of that? Because we all have bad days, and the challenge is making sure that they don't become string of bad days. I resonate with the principle there. I'm curious, are there any practical examples of that in the final, last few years? It could be as broad as like 15 years or in the past 5, in your church, moments where this didn't change the trajectory, the ultimate destination that the church was headed towards, but moments where you were really proud of what the church accomplished or what you accomplished despite those challenging conditions. For everyone listening, because many, many churches are in similar situations that you've been in the past 15 years, moments that you recall, be like, you know what? Despite the conditions and macro trends that I was a part of, we made the right choices and we did the right things. We were faithful in those times.
Yeah, so the one that I talk about a lot and I'm just so incredibly proud of is to tip my hand a little bit, I used to read a lot of Rob Bell back in the day. I still read a lot of Rob Bell. I think he's very helpful in some ways. He made this statement that I thought really kind of transformed the way I thought about ministry, which is, if your church closed down, would anyone outside your membership really care? And I thought, well, that's a motivating, convicting question, because at the time the answer was no, because we just served ourselves. And so we started this program called Brown Bag Friday, which we packed about 13 items of food for kids in the local school system. My kids go to public school here in Mount Vernon, and 85% of kids are on free or reduced lunch, which means it's one of the poorest districts in the region, if not the state. And the social workers were telling us that kids would come to school on Monday hungry because they literally did not eat the whole weekend. And we thought, well, that's stupid. You know, like in we have all these churches in our community and we're not feeding hungry kids. Like, is there anything more basic in this world than feeding hungry kids? Like, it's really hard to get mad about that. So we started a program, you know, about 15 years ago. And we started out doing 30 bags a week, thinking that's more than enough. Financially, we don't know if we can handle this, and just logistically. And we were doing at the end 275 bags a week. Feeding kids in our community. And all we did was we put 13 items in a brown paper sack. We put a little paper. There's a little piece of paper. No, at one point, one older guy in my church was like, let's put a tract in. I'm like, absolutely not. We're not doing that. We're not evangelizing with this. All it said was we love you. Here's our name. Here's our number. If you need anything, give us a call. And that's all we did. And we loved our community. We spent over $100,000 on that program, and we never, ever ran out of money. And one of our biggest fears at the end was, well, who's going to take over brown bags after we close down? And luckily, the Ministerial Alliance of our community stepped up and said, we'd be willing to do it. And then we took the last money that we had before we ran out of cash, about $15,000, and wrote them a check for them to continue to do the brown bag program. So whatever we did had a tangible impact on the community. And I think that's the thing is, if you're going down, go down swinging. You know what I mean? Go down helping people, serving people, loving people. And I can tell you this, when I doubted my calling, when I doubted my church, when I doubted myself, when I doubted my life, when I did not doubt at all was when I was packing those bags. I knew that was real. And to see 90-year-old women who could barely stand up pack 150 bags on a Sunday morning was an unbelievable blessing that I will take with me. And to watch my kids, by the way, who grew up in that church and started packing those bags when they were 3 and 4 years old and continued to do it when they were 10 and 12 years old, I taught them what it meant to be a good person and a person of faith and a follower of Jesus Christ by showing them. And I think that was the thing that I'll take with me for the rest of my life, and hopefully my kids will take with them for the rest of their lives. So just because you're small doesn't mean you can't change the world. And we absolutely did in our little community. And when we closed, we were missed because we were not doing brown bags anymore. And I think that's our legacy. That's what will live on for, even after most of us are dead, people will still be talking about the brown bag program.
I didn't anticipate this conversation being as an emotional journey for me as it has been. I feel like every answer, I'm just like, oh, like I feel that in my chest. You talked about handing off this amazing project. There are surely so many logistics when it comes to closing a church. It's not just deciding like, hey, we cannot sustain this any longer. It's we have a building. We have surely many other logistical things to go through. What's the process of selling a building, presumably, and like closing actually like?
There's no handbook for this, Brady. I'll let you know right now.
None of the pastors are writing books on it.
Yeah.
Maybe I should write a book about how to
that
close
would
a
be
church.
your next book. There you go.
Oh my gosh! Actually, would probably sell a lot of copies because that's
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like a direct title and a handbook and everything else. The problem is though, it's really no one size fits all. Yeah. I'll just describe our process to you so you can take that for what it's worth. So we were in a building that was built in the 1960s, about 15,000 square feet, on about 8 acres of prime property on a highway, really well located. By the end, even when I got there, we were using maybe 20% of the building, and the utility costs were $25,000 a year, and the insurance was insane. To replace the roof was $70,000. So it was really an albatross on our necks. And it used to be we had older guys in the church who were retired but could still work on stuff like fix plumbing and drywall and little things. By the end, we had no one. So it was basically me and one other guy were our fix-it guys, and I'm not a handyman by training. Like I just mess around and make mistakes. So we put it up. Okay, so first off, we got try to get an appraisal. Good luck getting an appraisal on a church because there are no comps to compare your church to. So the appraisal came back and it said, okay, $400,000. And I asked the guy, "Are you sure about that?" He goes, "No, I'm not sure about this at all." But how do you comp a building like this? And I was like, "Yeah, you're right." So $400,000. We put it on the market for $300,000. We put it on Facebook, like literally guerrilla style on Facebook, because we don't want to pay a commercial realtor and they're going to take 10% off the top or whatever. So we had about 15 groups walk through, and it was like, man, I could write a book about those groups that walked through. It was like church planners who wanted to start. I'm like, don't start in this building, dude. You're going to die. Like it'll kill you. But people are optimistic, and we ended up getting one offer that was $150,000. And the guy told me, God told me this is all we can offer because this is all the cash we have on hand. I said, well, God told me we can't take it. Because we would not have been able to move to a new place for $150,000 is nothing at the end of the day when it comes to, build out and lease and all that stuff. So we politely declined. And then we had another church come in and offer us our asking price, $300,000, but they had to sell their church in order to buy our church. So it was a contingent offer, and it was a year. They tried to sell their church, and they didn't sell their church, so that didn't go through either. And so what ended up happening was there is a classical Christian school that opened in Mount Vernon. Second Baptist Church was actually a church plant of First Baptist Church about 100 years ago. They needed a building because their school had outgrown their church building. They come to us and they say, we would like to come up with an arrangement. And I'm not going to get all the details are really complicated, but here's the upshot of the whole thing. They took over the building. We got to stay there. We paid $100 a month in rent for copying, trash, utilities. And we were there on Saturday, Sunday, Monday, because I didn't have school on Monday. And their school met Tuesday through Friday during the school year. So basically, we were tenants of them. And so we were in that situation for about 5 or 6 years at the end. And we were kind of two ships passing in the night, to be honest with you. Like when they were there, they were there. And when we were there, we were there. We hardly ever saw each other. I bet I talked to people there 3 or 4 times a year at the end, at the most, and we shared a building. And so the way the contracts are written was if we dissolve, the building becomes completely theirs, and if they dissolve, the building became completely ours, and we were worried that they might close because then the building would become our property again, and we would be sunk in 6 months financially. So we got out while the getting was good, I suppose, and they took over that whole. And so the other part of that too is once we gave them the building, we had to start downsizing all our stuff in the building. So we spent a couple of years just selling off different items, chairs and robes and you name it. And at the end, all we really had was one checking account. We had like a couple of pulpits and communion tables and pews. And at the end, it took about 2 weeks for us to liquidate all our assets and be dissolved completely because we did it slowly over like an 8 or 10 year period of time, as opposed to just waiting to the end and saying, okay, bye, handing the keys to our denomination and walking away.
Wow. I know as you're sharing that story, I know personally and locally, like a full handful of churches who are in similar situations where they're leasing, like a big old United Church that congregation dissolved, and so they're sharing that space. And if I know that many churches personally and locally, I know that a lot of churches listening to this show and listening to this conversation are in a similar situation. And you've been so gracious to share how your story, at least the story of that congregation, ended. And but you're also not shy to say that there is, just because your church has had their last Sunday service, that there is not hope for churches who are in similar situations. So I'm sure that speaks to a lot of folks listening to this today. Ryan, I do have to thank you for your vulnerability and how gracious you've been to share this story, not just with us today, but online. You've written multiple essays. You've been interviewed by some rather large publications. It sounds like you're going to write a book about this someday. So I do have to thank you for that, like as a person and as a pastor, just having the grace and the humility to share this. Like it's a really tender story, but to share it and share it honestly.
Right, because there's no value coming to Ryan from this.
Yeah.
He's only bringing value to others. And the vast majority of folks, understandably, would do this quietly, and you would move on, and you would refocus on this very successful Substack. Like, there's no reason that Ryan had to do this.
Yeah. There's this lyric from this small little band in Asheville, North Carolina. They say, you pray for resurrection, but you're too scared to die. And so your story, although it is a story about a church closing its doors, now I'm speaking personally as a pastor of a smaller congregation here in rural Niagara, like it gives me resurrection hope just to hear the courage that you and your congregation had to let this thing die. It's really encouraging to me. But listen, you're a researcher, and you've said it on the show today. You've said it before. You look for safety, security, surety in data. But you've admitted that you're entirely unsure about the future of faith in America. And frankly, Ryan, you've said this online, the future of your own faith. You've said that. You're just unsure. So not even the data can tell you what the future of either of those things are, the future of faith in America or the future of the faith of Ryan Burge. So I got to ask you, where are you feeling or finding hope, either personally or professionally right now?
Well, first, thanks, guys. I mean, that encouragement was what I needed, because I don't know how this happened, but the Associated Press wrote a story about my church closing. Religion News Service, Bob Smetana from there showed up at my church and reported on my church closing. And then I wrote like a 4,000 word essay for Deseret about what it felt like for my church to close. And like those three things came out like 1 week apart from each other. And I was just getting inundated with emails and DMs and LinkedIn messages and phone calls at the church. And to be honest with you, it actually probably made me feel worse than better, because the sentiment you guys shared was not the sentiment I was getting for a lot of those messages. A lot of it was, I can help you resurrect your church. I can help you replant your church. It's like this savior complex that a lot of evangelicals have is just disgusting, to be honest with you. At some point, you got to let things die. You can't save everything. And I think it's like, you know what it felt like? It's like my wife had stage 4 cancer and was like, we'd gone through all the conventional treatments, and then some faith healer or like herbalist comes along and goes, I can save your wife. Just let me try. Like, no. We are not there. You know, sometimes things die, and that's what has to happen. And then they were blaming me because I wasn't full-time. I didn't give it my all. And we were part of a mainline tradition. We were a liberal church, which is hilarious because we are the least thing from a liberal church as far as I can tell. At least from the pulpit, I can tell you we weren't a liberal church. And from the pews, we weren't either. So it's like everyone was trying to make sense of this for them so it wouldn't happen to them, those people personally. And that really, really sucked, to be honest with you. Like at one point, I was like, I wish my email address was not public. I almost emailed the university president and said, could you turn my email off for a while? Because I can't deal with this. I mean, I got like 100 messages. And then you go on Reddit and read the comments, and you're like, you people don't know there.
Never search a name on Reddit. No.
Never, ever do that. It was a huge, but you know how you go in a downward spiral late at night sometimes when you're just, wanting to dump on yourself. So I really appreciate that, guys. And to me, it was, I wanted people to know that this is more than just numbers on a spreadsheet. This is real people. People are really struggling in this moment. I think the way that I always understand history is, like, I can understand the macro level movements, but you need to understand at the individual level too. Like, how are people's lives in America shaped by the Civil War? Mm-hmm. Like I listened to this great podcast called The Deserter from the New York Times. It's about Russian men who are being conscripted to fight in Ukraine that don't want to fight. And they're hitting their hands with hammers to break their hands so they don't have to go. Like, let's make this real. And the decline of religion it's a graph on my Twitter, but it's also my real life. Mm-hmm. And there are 10 people now who have to find a new home to worship in because my church closed. Let's not forget that. And I think it's so easy to look at the big trends and forget about the individual stories inside that. Now, where does my hope come from? My hope comes from the fact that I went to the United Methodist Church on Sunday, and half my congregation was there sitting next to me in the pew.
Oh, that's awesome.
And we were just so happy to see each other because I've been bouncing around. I went to the Catholic Church. I've gone to the United Methodist Church. I've gone to a bunch of different churches. And to see those people still gather together and me not having to preach just really gave me a lot of hope, because I'm honestly, not stoked about doing that, because I did it for 17 and a half years. And I bet I average less than 2 Sundays a year off for 17 and a half years. Wow. So to not have that burden on my life has actually in some ways freed me up to do, I think, what God's calling me to in this season of my life. Right. And I'm preaching, but just doing it in a different way, not from a pulpit on a Sunday morning, but when I'm traveling around the country talking about religious decline and what it means for America and how it's going to hurt us, I think individually, collectively, and as a society. And I think that to me is that seeing that God has laid out a different way that I can minister to people, not in a traditional pastoral way, has been the really amazing thing. And I was asked like a week ago, do you miss the pulpit? I go, I got a pulpit every Monday and every Thursday, dude. Mm-hmm. I reach so many people with the Substack and just show them what the data says and try to help them understand the world. That's ministry. That's a ministry in a non-sectarian, non-religious way. I'm helping people. And I think to me, that's given me hope and peace and joy and comfort. And also knowing that those people who were part of my church I think almost all of them have found a new home to go to. Man, that's a win. That's a win for me. It's a win for them. It's a win for us.
Hope for the future. Hope for the next season. Beautiful closing note to our conversation, Ryan. We'll check in with you shortly, as we always do. For everyone listening, thank you for your time, attention, and trust. We'll talk to you next Wednesday.